Welcome to the Old Man of the Three Things with JJ Redick and Steve Jones. We're -1. We're -1 this morning. You know what? I'm actually really looking forward to this. You know, the guy's he just talks over us all the time. It's just so disruptive.
Oh man, I'm here. I'm happy. Exciting basketball. Game 7s are weird. I will give a nod to Nikias because I'm sure he would have said this today. One of Luka Doncic, Anthony Edwards, Jayson Tatum, or Tyrese Hailburton is going to win a championship.
Yeah, there we go. I think overall, these playoffs, to some degree, the entire season, it feels like a passing of the torch. Now, if Denver had won and we're here today, you know, there's still the possibility Jokic gets his repeat, but we're not there. We're not there. There's going to be a new best player on the best team that wins a championship, right?
Yep.
There's not many of those guys that are active. Jokic added to the list last year. We're going to have another one this year. So it is truly going to be a passing of the torch moment. Rather, you know, RJ and I did our sort of reactions last night to the Game 7s. I agree with you. Game 7s are always weird. I thought the Minnesota-Denver series in general was strange. It was just a strange series. It was hard to digest, or not digest, but sort of predict what was going to happen game to game. But let's start with that series in terms of the Western Conference Finals. Dallas Mavericks beat OKC in 6 games. Minnesota goes on the road, beats Denver in a Game 7 where they're down 20 points in the second half. I think there's a lot of interesting things about this series, but I just want to start in general with, what do you think the sort of one or two biggest keys to you are for either team, or just an overall matchup that you're particularly zeroed in on?
I think it's going to be which team can establish their identity. Defense comes to mind for me with both of them because of the ways that they have gotten to the conference finals, establishing their defense on either end of the floor. I think it ties back to something you've said a lot during these playoffs. You got your Batmans, you got your Robins, you need your Alfreds. This is a series where, hey, we have Batmans, we have Robins, but the Alfreds are going to have to show up. My mind is more intrigued to see how each team tries to defend each other, what they start out with, and what they land on. So what is Minnesota going to start out with? Is it going to be just drop with Rudy? Is Kyrie going to have space and he's going to be able to operate? And he's done a really good job, especially in that OKC series, balancing the playmaking and the shot making. How do they treat Luka? Is Cat going to switch on to him? What does that open up for Dallas? On the other end, Anthony Edwards, are you going to show help? Are you going to be able to rotate like you did against Oklahoma City? How does Cat get loose is probably what I'm thinking about as well, because he's so important to that Minnesota offense. And so does he get the same switches? Does he get double teamed? Is he able to catch in the right spots? That's where my mind kind of starts with, because I think we know both teams can defend. Only one of them is really going to impose their will in this series. And I just want to see where they start with and how they get there.
I'm glad you started with the defense, because that was the first thing I sort of wrote down. Was I feel and the playoffs, because of pace and because of a lot of the physicality, it's felt like outside of a few games here and there in each series, it's felt like a defensive playoffs, right? And I think this probably encapsulates these playoffs more than anything, because I look at this as a defensive series. Dallas, of course, #1 defense in the NBA the last 20 games of the regular season. We've watched them against the Clippers. We've watched them against OKC. They do a lot of things really well. They have a lot of size. They have a lot of length. They've got the engagement from Kyrie and Luka. Josh Green off the bench, providing the ball pressure component, which I want to touch on in a second. And of course, Minnesota, who, you know, I think has been hyperbolized as people saying it's been the greatest defense they've ever seen. I'm not going to go that far, but certainly the best defense in the NBA this season, and a very formidable group. Some of it is personnel, some of it is schemes, but this is a defensive series. I don't expect this to be a high-paced, high-scoring series. Luka always does a good job of controlling pace. Dallas, I think, was 8th in pace during the regular season, so they do look for opportunities to run. The biggest thing for me, for both teams, is how do we get 2 on the ball?
Mm.
That is the biggest thing for me. And you bring up the drop stuff with Rudy. So sort of like when I look at matchups, I think I would expect Jaden McDaniels to start on Luka. And I probably would expect Anthony Edwards, if not starting on Kyrie, to take some of those Kyrie matchups. Mike Conley as well, of course. So with Luka, you think about, let's say, the Clippers series where they were in drop, and they did a really good job of cutting off drives. Terrence Mann, for most of that series, was into the ball, didn't allow Luka to put him in jail and put him in a disadvantageous spot. Jaden McDaniels is going to have his hands full, but again, you've got Rudy there on the back line. So Luka, and I thought at times in the OKC series, he did get 2 on the ball, and it's PJ Washington in the corner, right? They're playing out of rotation. Josh Green gets a drive, they get a lob, right? So if Minnesota can stay out of rotation and just basically say, we're going to trust Jaden McDaniels, we're going to trust Anthony Edwards, we're going to trust Mike Conley, we're going to trust Nickeil Alexander-Walker to guard these guys and make life miserable, then I think Dallas at times will have trouble to score. And that's not to say Luka, Kyrie are not going to make ridiculous shots. Luka, Kyrie are not going to have 40-point outbursts against this defense. I'm not saying that. They're 2 of the greatest offensive players in the world. But if Minnesota can stay out of rotation and not put 2 on the ball against this team, what does that do, Steve? It's the other guys. You shut that water off.
And that's going to be the big one. And now, based on what you said, my mind is thinking, okay, what would the adjustment be? Do we now just put other guys in action? Do we try and get Anthony Edwards to switch and make him navigate? Do we try and get Luka to switch on Conley and get a post up that way? Now, the importance of Kyrie, to where, okay, that guy can make those shots to where we don't feel as comfortable with that. Do we see that? Like, I feel like Minnesota is at their best when they are able to defend with conviction. And if Dallas is in that kind of standpoint, like you mentioned, where they can trust their guys to stay home, and now the kickouts are there, but we can close back out. We have help points, guys we can help off of. Rudy's protecting the paint. That's where Dallas has to avoid in this series. They can't let Minnesota defend with that level of conviction. And so I'm trying to think, like, if Luka is able to score in the post and make plays in pick and roll, I think it gets really tough for Minnesota. If he can cycle through their personnel, I think it gets really tough.
Okay. So let's assume for a second that Karl-Anthony Towns, maybe he's on Derek Jones Jr. Let's assume Anthony Edwards, Mike Conley, one of them is on PJ Washington, or vice versa. Cat's on PJ Washington, one of them is on Derek Jones Jr. So whether it's just in space or it's to create a switch, Luka brings one of those guys up. He then gets Jaden McDaniels, Anthony Edwards off of him. Maybe he likes the Anthony Edwards matchup as this series progresses. But again, you use the first screener, and you can do it in space, or you can do it just to manipulate the matchup. I didn't want to talk about this yet because I wanted to do this in the Boston Indy thing. But, dang it. Something really bothered me during the Indy Knicks series, particularly Game 6 and 7, just because I called those games and I was, courtside watching it. And it's going to be interesting in that series, and we'll get to Hailburton's defense and his shows in a second. But Joe Mazzulla is going to go after Hailburton, right? And let's say it's Jayson Kidd and Luka say, all right, we want to go after this guy, and they have some success with it. And they're like, all right, we're gonna hedge, or we're gonna show. What New York was doing with Hailburton's man on those screens is they were holding the screen. And Hailburton, particularly in 6 and 7, did an excellent job of rerouting the basketball. The screens were so high that Jalen Brunson was coming off at 35, 40 feet. And because Hailburton did a good job on the show, and because they were holding the screen, there was enough time for Nesmith, whomever it was, to get back in front. And it was bugging me because the reason teams don't hedge anymore is because all you have to do is slip behind the defense or ghost screen it, and you've created a 4-on-3. And it was driving me crazy. It was driving me crazy. There was one time in Game 7 where Josh Hart literally was like, "Oh, I can slip behind," and then Jaylen didn't pass the ball, so then he stopped. Jaylen threw it to him. And then he went to a DHO, and Nesmith ran through Josh Hart and it was a foul. But my point is, whether it's Cat not wanting to switch onto Luka, potentially Mike Conley, though I think they'll trust him initially in this series. There are opportunities if you're going to be in a hedge and you're going to be in a hard show to bring a player up and create a 4-on-3. The advantage that Luka has, and an advantage that a lot of these bigger wings and bigger ball handlers have, is that they can see over the top of the defense, right? So they can make that pass with a simple jump pass, a direct pass, a little floating pass. Now all of a sudden you've got a guy going downhill 4-on-3. So that's another just little X and O thing that I'm like, will Minnesota be in a show if he does the thing we're talking about, which is target a specific guy to then get into the main action?
And then it ties back to, hey, there's 2 on the ball, and now they're having to rotate. And I'm glad you mentioned the Cat matchup, because in my mind, if he's on Derrick Jones Jr., if he's on P.J. Washington in theory, does that now unlock them as screeners and rollers? And now you're able to create an advantage that way and get them on the short roll, get a kick. Rudy's obviously done a good job in the paint and stunning, but I'm intrigued by kind of the little gaps Dallas can find. Anthony Edwards, how much do you think Anthony Edwards looks to attack Luka and Kyrie in this series?
Yeah, I would say he will look to attack them for sure. And if as that sort of series progressed with Denver, he was comfortable with whatever matchup he had, and part of that was Denver was double teaming him so much, right? So I think the thought process there was, if I go target someone and bring them up into a pick and roll where they're just going to double team me, right? So, it was interesting because there was some stuff last night as I was watching the game and following along on Twitter, because that's unfortunately what I do sometimes when I watch games. There was some stuff talking about his reads, right? And I think this potentially, regardless of if they double team, if they blitz, I think this potentially is the biggest thing for Minnesota in this series. Anthony Edwards didn't have 7 great games against Denver, but he averaged 28 on 50% shooting and 37% from 3. Like, he had a great series, right? His ability to make reads against the length of Dallas, whether it's on his drives, trying to hit a weak side, whether it's in a double team, whether it's in pick and roll, and Gafford or Lively is in a drop, that to me is a key part of this offense for Minnesota, because Dallas throughout the playoffs, they have used the length to create deflections, turnovers, get out in transition. And again, if you're talking about half-court offense and half-court defense, this is going to be a bloodbath at times in this series. As teams make adjustments, there's always the weird game. There's always the weird game where there's an adjustment or somebody has a high shot variance. But I think overall in the half court, it's going to be tough to score. Even though these teams have unbelievably good players on the offensive end. So Edwards' ability to make reads and not turn the ball over against this length of Dallas, I think, is huge.
I think it's key too. The shot making is key. The play making has been huge. I think the willingness to make the reads, depending on the help you're showing, has been big.
Yeah.
If Minnesota's able to get stops and Anthony Edwards is able to attack and transition or early offense, that opens up a new layer. I think for Dallas, one thing you mentioned, the size and the length. I've loved the timing on their rotations to where they've been able to just kind of shorten windows for you, where you think a play is there. Now there's a big here. They're releasing and kind of rotating that way. So he's going to have to make sure he makes the right reads. I'm very intrigued as I think about Dallas in rotation. Karl-Anthony Towns is a little bit different. OKC couldn't necessarily find the balance between drive and kick and drive and score. And Cat's got that ability to, well, I can just shoot this or I'll drive, make a play. The big passing that he could have with Rudy in this series could be interesting. But when it comes to Edwards, he, again, if he's able to feel comfortable with those matchups, and now Dallas has to feel like they have to show more help, that's where it gets tricky. Like, my mind is trying to think about how much does Dallas want to put two on the ball as well? What are their rotations?
When I brought it up, I was basically talking about Luka and Ant. Yeah, for sure. It's both sides of that. Yeah.
Because in my mind, Dallas was able to settle in both of those two series with, hey, this is what we're giving you. But do they get uncertain? If Cat has it going, is that now you have to post in the double? It's different rotation. If Ant's driving, is the help going to be there? So that's where it's like, okay, if Dallas gets dinged there, we have a whole different ballgame.
Yeah. Luka is clearly banged up. He has had a few Luka-esque games where he's distributing, playmaking, scoring efficiently. But overall, it's very clear. I mean, I was watching the game the other night. They listed 4 things that he's dealing with, right? Knee, ankle, shoulder, elbow, wrist, Achilles, whatever. It's just he's banged up, right? He's banged up. And I think you could make an argument that Dallas has won against the Clippers and Dallas has won against the number 1 seed, Oklahoma City, without Luka being at his best. So a question for you, can Dallas win this series if Luka is not at his best?
They could, but boy, it ain't going to be easy. I think the difference is if Luka's not at his best, Minnesota is now able to stay out of rotation and trust their defense, as you mentioned earlier, and stick in that drop and contest Luka's shots. And now how much of the playmaking is opening up? How much is he creating for everyone else? I don't think Dallas likes that version of the series. They were able to kind of survive some of those moments against OKC when Luka didn't have it going. And you could tell the moments where Luka was trying to, okay, I need to hit this shot or I need to go for this. Miss, OKC pushes, they're gone. I don't think that Minnesota, I don't think that Dallas survives a bad Luka series against this defense. Because where are you going to go? Unless Kyrie just goes nuts. Yeah. That's going to be a really tough thing because they need Luka scoring and they need to open things up.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned Kyrie because I think to me that's sort of you look in a series and you're like, all right, what's the swing here? Like what can swing a series one way or another? And to me, I mean, this seems obvious, but I think it's important because Kyrie wasn't the best version of himself against Oklahoma City either, right? And he was certainly efficient, but in terms of volume and what he was at during the Clippers series and what he was at all season, it wasn't the best version of himself. I thought he played well. I'm not saying he didn't play well. But I think his scoring, his aggressiveness, even at volume, I think is really important in this series. Like this could be a series where you're just like, Kyrie, we actually need you to take 20 to 25 shots a night, particularly if all that rotation stuff is not happening, right? We're asking you, Rudy Gobert's in a drop. We're asking you to go create, right? For yourself, right? We're a little bogged down. We're asking you to go create in isolation for yourself. And he has to be more than comfortable to do that. Because I think that could ultimately, maybe it's not every game, could ultimately swing a game where Dallas gets a little bogged down offensively. Kyrie does his magic, right? The other thing on this series I think is just interesting is just the bench. And you brought up the role player stuff, and I talk about this all the time, the Alfreds, blah, blah, blah. Naz Reid, so massive in that game 7 second half last night. Just that stretch. We talked about it on the live reaction last night with me and RJ. Like, it goes from 85-82 to 92-82 because Naz Reid makes 4 straight plays, right? So he's massive. Nickeil Alexander-Walker is massive. We talk about his defense. Look, he's a guy who is more than capable. He's been a little inconsistent in the playoffs, of course. He's more than capable of going 4 for 5 from 3 in a game.
Mm-hmm.
So he can swing a game. On the other side, Derek Lively and his ability to offensive rebound, defend the paint. Tim Hardaway Jr., he throughout his career has had these sort of massive swings in efficiency where for 4 or 5 games, you're like, oh, he's in a shooting slump. And then the next 7 games, you're like, holy shit. That's the second coming of Vinnie Johnson. I love it. So he's gonna be huge as well. I look at the benches and think what games and how these teams can create an advantage through that. I think Naz Reid probably is sort of the biggest swing or X factor when we talk about the benches.
I would agree with that. I think Naz Reid, his ability to drive is going to be huge in this series, especially with how Dallas likes to defend. So if he's able to get paint touches and finish that way, it's big. With Dallas's bench, it feels like they need a Tim Hardaway Jr. series. They need his shooting. They need his spacing. If he's able to also be someone who makes Minnesota think, that gets really interesting. I know Derrick Jones Jr. not a part of the bench, but if he can continue to make defenses pay, that's just the story for Dallas. Can we make you pay for how you want to defend us?
Yeah. Both PJ and Derrick Jones Jr., they're shooting and catch and shoot stuff off the ball. And truthfully, at times, attacking closeouts. I think both those guys in both the series have had some really nice moments attacking closeouts and making plays. The big thing, last thing I mentioned, because it's the last thing on my notes for this series, was just, with Lively and Gafford's, a big part of the Dallas half-court offense is the threat of them behind.
Mm-hmm.
And for a lot of the Clippers series, they were unable to get behind. In that Oklahoma City series, at times, you think about Chet, by the way, in that game 6. How many times did he get behind the defense? Right? It's like, so I think with Gobert, where he's positioned, these guys may just have to buy into, like, we have to get every offensive rebound and nothing can happen at the rim. Like, we have to, that is our job this series. It's not, I just don't envision it where Gobert all of a sudden is like, I'm going to be way up and I'm going to allow Gafford and Lively to get behind and there's a vertical lob threat or we're in rotation. I just don't see Minnesota, unless these guys are, shooting 70% through 3 games and just absolutely torching these guys. I just don't see Minnesota making that adjustment. I think Gobert is going to be in that heavy drop. And again, it's going to go back to, okay, how do we manipulate some matchups here? Let's move on to Indy, Boston. Just some overall thoughts from you on Boston's playoffs so far.
They've done their job, taking care of business. Everything they need to do in those series, they accomplished. And I think, there's probably going to be some adversity talk, but they did lose game 2 of each of those series and immediately had to go snatch it back. It's going to be a different adjustment, but Jayson Tatum has been able to make plays, make reads, and drive. Jaylen Brown has been really, really good in this playoffs. I hope people realize the numbers that he's put up. And you mix in Drew Holiday and Derek White and their impact on both ends. So I just think it's been a taking care of business run so far. This is going to be a different series for both these teams, though.
How so with Indiana?
I think with Indiana, my mind comes to, one, Boston has stronger defensive personnel to a degree in which we feel, or in theory, they could feel comfortable with a lot more switching. And I think Boston offensively on the other end, they can attack Indiana in different ways to where Indiana's defense, not known for it, but they've been active. And as the series has gone on, they've found different ways to impact things. They've made adjustments. Once they key in on things, they've been pretty good. When Boston has the full weight of their lineup, we can just kind of toggle different things. And your help points are now, okay, we're leaving Derek White, or we're leaving Drew Holiday, or it's Al Horford or Kristaps when he comes back. Boston can keep Indiana in rotation, and Boston can also kind of mix and match and attack different items if they have that right mindset offensively, which is always the question for me with Boston. But if you think about, okay, we don't want to switch Tyrese Hailburton onto this matchup, that works, but that's Drew Holiday potentially short roll. That's Derek White potentially on the short roll. They can make those plays. They kick out. Look who's catching the ball. That's where Indiana's now going to have to sustain defense in a different way. So I just think, in my mind, can Indiana find the gaps offensively? Because they're going to play. They're a collective. They play with great pace. But then defensively, if Boston does what they need to do, are they going to be able to sustain their defense over the course of a series?
Yeah, I think I want to talk about Indy's offense versus Boston's defense, but I think it's less important to, can Indy stop Boston? That's the question mark. You go sort of even really down the line with Boston, and I feel like there's a lot of favorable matchups that they have. And their ability to get teams in rotation, and I think specifically about this series, Missoula, and this is why I brought it up earlier with the hedges with Hailburton. So whether it is a straight pick and roll, whether it is their sort of V2 horns 2 action where they go to that triangle rip screen, slip to get behind, they're going to get behind the defense. Like if Hailburton, whether he's switching or not, they manipulate these screening angles so well. And you've got Al Horford spaced, you've got Jaylen Brown spaced on the weak side, whoever, Drew Holiday. So the communication's got to be excellent. How they guarded New York in terms of physicality, being up to touch, the off-ball defense on DiVincenzo, particularly games 4 through 6, that stuff is going to be massive. But this is a very different team to guard. It just is. And the sort of marker for me, I think about what makes these two offenses great. For me, with Indy, it's their ability to spread you out, have multiple actions, create multiple closeouts, and eventually they're going to score in the paint. Number 1 team in the league in points in the paint. And a lot of that is because they are playing so fast, even off of makes, that it's hard to set your defense. They just flow right into actions using throw ahead passes, get ahead passes, whatever. So that's them. With Boston, I think the marker for me this series is going to be the rotations and the 3-point volume. Like, can Indiana win the math game against Boston? That, in some ways, is I think, as important as any matchup or whatever, any strategic thing. It's like, can we limit the 3-point shots? Can we limit the defensive errors that cause a breakdown and into rotation? And so sometimes I think, look, I think sometimes when you play Boston, you got to be like, hey, we're kind of willing to live with Jayson Tatum, Jaylen Brown, taking ISO tough 2s, taking ISO tough step back 3s. Like, in some ways, you have to be willing to live with that against a favorable matchup. Do you know what I mean by that?
Yeah. Yeah.
Otherwise, you're just in rotation. They're just gonna rain 3s, or they're gonna score at the rim.
And I think that's where it gets interesting. How much switching does Indiana want to do? What do they want to live with? Do they employ pressure just to kind of get Boston to start their sets later? Because in my mind, if there's a concern, if you're Boston, which way do you go? With the way the Pacers play, do you get trapped into that to a degree where now you're taking some quicker shots? You mentioned the 3-point volume. Which type of threes are you generating? Are these pull-ups? Are these quick ones off pick and roll? Or are these the ones where Indiana's in rotation and they've had to defend and they're trying to recover? Do you slow down too much? And now it's, okay, we feel comfortable with Tatum attacking this matchup or Brown attacking this matchup. There's 16 on the clock. We've just started our action. They only had to defend one pick and roll, and they stayed at home, to your point, to try and get you to take a tough two. And now we miss. Indiana zooms the other way. Is that where the series could get shaky? But can Indiana put Boston in that zone over the course of 7 games, you know?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the ball pressure, because I was thinking about it this morning, and obviously we'll find out. We'll find out. That's the beautiful thing about sports. We can sit here and talk, and we're just like, oh, that's what they were thinking. Okay, all right, you know what I mean? But I was thinking about the ball pressure component, and there's 2 teams that have pressured more in the backcourt, significantly more than everybody else in the playoffs, and it's the Minnesota Timberwolves and the Indiana Pacers. There was a ton of possessions in this series against New York where the Pacers had not 1, not 2, but 3 defenders in the backcourt. And if you look across the board in these NBA playoffs in the tracking era, I mentioned this in Game 6 on the broadcast, there have been more possessions with backcourt defensive pressure on average across the league than in any other playoffs in the tracking era. And it's not an insignificant margin. It's 36 possessions, on average this season versus I think the second was like 28. So this is a key thing. So you bring up the pace. How fast does Boston want to play? And there are times, they're an awesome team and they're great. But there are times when they get a little bit slower and a little bit less decisive and can get bogged down. That's been the case, whether it's been Brad Stevens, Ime Udoka, Joe Mazzulla, like that has happened. All right. So if Indy pressures, does that slow them down a little bit? Does that make them more deliberate? If Indy's then try to play in a track meet, does Boston then try to play in a track meet? So, stuff like Jaylen Brown in transition, right? He was one of the best players in transition in the NBA. Like, how much can he get loose in transition? The last piece on this that I wanted to just talk about is it is remarkable and it should be intuitive, but we don't talk about it enough. It's remarkable in a league where everybody's always talking, it's a make or miss league. It's a make or miss league. For sure it is. The statistics this postseason on the rebounding battle, where the teams that win the rebounding battle have won something like 55 games and they've lost 13 or 14 games. There's a massive disparity. And Indy, in that Knicks series, they lost every game. They lost the rebounding battle. But there was a toughness and a pursuit of the basketball that I thought was really important, and it's going to be important again. It's the little stuff, the Aaron Nesmith keeping a ball alive, getting a second possession. For Boston, it's Peyton Pritchard crashing out of the corner. Like, you look at these little swing things, and they happen all the time. End of quarters, start of quarters, a star getting a rest. All of a sudden, TJ McConnell comes in. They go up 5 more points in 3 minutes, right? These type of little stretches in games and little plays in games are not insignificant. And so I think the rebounding battle will be important in this. It always is, but I think it'll be really important in this Boston-Indy series.
I agree. And the data backs it up. It'll be interesting. I mean, Boston has to find a way to crash the glass. Indiana can't give those up. But for some reason, while you were saying that, I was trying to think about how Boston defends Indiana and how different of a series that's going to be for them. And can Indiana make those plays where they are able to get rebounds offensively? And now they get some of those easier threes. Like, it's not purely a pick and roll series. Like, we know Indiana has pace and tempo and ball movement, player movement. Boston's going to have to sustain their defense. And they're going to have to find a way to continue to make those efforts and make those rotations in a way they haven't had to in the playoffs so far. You know, in my mind, I was like, hey, if Miami can find their movement, they couldn't. If Cleveland can find their movement, they just didn't have enough people. If Boston is now constantly in rotation and they're reacting on defense, what does this series look like? Or does Boston find a way to say, hey, we're going to switch. We'll bog you down that way. We feel comfortable with these people guarding Tyrese. We feel comfortable with these people guarding Pascal. We're going to take away Myles Turner, take him off the table so he can't hurt us in multiple ways like he's done during this postseason. That is where it gets interesting, because if Boston can sustain their defense and play it at a high level, I think Indiana's path to victory, the margin's slim.
I'm curious to see how Joe matches up, because I think he has some options. In particular, who guards Siakam. Does he use Drew as a little bit of a roamer, as he's done at times this season? Does Drew take the Siakam matchup? How much is Drew on Hailburton? I would expect Derek White to start on Hailburton, but how he uses Drew this series defensively is going to be interesting to me. It's one of the fun things all season about Boston is, certain games you're like, oh, Drew's got the primary guy. And then you're like, oh, Drew's got the fifth guy. Let's see what creative stuff Joe does with Drew. So fascinating stuff. I'm so excited for both these series. I really am. Steve, thank you as always. Nikias, we missed you, but we managed.
We found a way.
We found a way. All right, man.